afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, whatever time it is. Welcome to another series of music appreciation lectures. This lecture is going to be the first of a series of lectures dealing with the Renaissance, moving into the Baroque period. And what we're going to do now is take the material and lessons that we've learned in the first section of the class and now apply it to music history, and so that you can see how music in the Western world has developed until the popular music and the music of today. Now, the one thing that I want to say right off the bat in this section of the class is that we're going to be dealing with Western European musical traditions. We're not going to be talking about China. We're not going to be going into India or into Africa. I would need another 2 years to apply the musical history and the musical terminology and the musical world in those different cultures. And the reason is that in this class, I am more interested in making sure that my students understand that the human experience, and particularly when it involves music, is a huge, huge part of the human existence. And so for the purposes of this class, we're going to now look at what we would call the European model, or the Western European musical culture. All right, now the first thing we want to talk about is that in our textbook, the hymnal, as it were, the enjoyment of music, there it is. You're all familiar with it now. What we're going to do is concentrate on pages 70 to 147. All right, so let me write that on the board right now. So this section of the class starts at page 70 and moves to page 147. We're talking about chapters 12 through 20. We're talking about the culture of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, moving into the Baroque period and to the early Classic period. Pages 70 to 147 is what will be responsible now. I'm told by my students that one of the things they like about my video lectures is that they can pause it, take some notes, write some things down, and then they can continue. This is one of those times. Page 70, page 147. This is the material that will be on the second examination. Okay. One of the things that's most important to understand about this period of music is that we need to remember what was happening in Western Europe in that time in general. And we're talking from 476 AD to the year 1450. Now, that's not an exact date, but we're roughly talking 1,000 years of humankind. And what we need to remember is that there wasn't France, there wasn't Germany, there wasn't Belgium, England, there wasn't governments per se. What we have to remember is that this time there were essentially one ruling power. And that ruling power was the Roman Catholic Church. And so for our purposes talking about music, we're talking about sacred music, which is the music of the church, and talking about secular music, which is folk music, non-church music, music of the people that was outside of the auspices of church. And what we need to remember, and this is most important, when you watch a Hollywood film, say Braveheart, or say maybe the movie a couple years ago, 300, got a lot of attention. Hollywood tends to really make these things, they kind of prettify them. What you need to understand that if you weren't part of the church in the year 476 AD, you had a horrible life. Just trying to survive. What'd you have for breakfast this morning? Oh, I had a handful of grass. You have some coffee with that? No, there was some rainwater that we collected in a little clay goblet we had. That was the water. Or maybe you just drank it out of the stream and hoped that there wasn't some sort of parasites in it. You have to remember that Middle Ages of humankind, these are desperate times. This is why the word chaos is up here. If you're not part of the order of the Roman Catholic Church, if your father isn't a nobleman and you live in a castle, you pretty much are just scraping out an existence, and it's not a pretty sight. Okay, so let us begin how music, fits into this. So what we need to understand is that the music of the church is the music that is the most documented, the most recommended. It's what survived. And I'm going to play you some examples of that, and we're going to go back to the week 1 listening folder. We're going to play music music for a night, and this is an example of Gregorian chant, first chant. Now, this word patronage is important. It's in the key point in the prelude for the second section of this. This is on page 70. Much surviving music from the Middle Ages is religious or sacred because of the sponsorship and the patronage of the church. Now that's straight out of the key points of your textbook. As you've heard me say on the other lectures, you'll hear me say it in this lecture and lectures that are going to be given in the future. Most of the information in each chapter that's important is in the key points at the beginning of the chapter. If something is mentioned in the key points, it's important, you need to know it. I'm going to give you specific pages in this lecture that you need to write down, study. You will be responsible for this information for your next examination. All right. We understand that the Roman Catholic Church is one of great order. Nothing happens in that church that doesn't have some sort of importance. In other words, it's not an improvised thing. The Pope just doesn't get up in the morning and say, yeah, I think I'll wear yellow today. I feel like a yellow day. No, everything is organized. And the music of the church is extremely organized. When we talk about a Catholic Mass, we're talking about the highest religious service in the church, and every piece of music is organized and has a specific purpose. Well, what is that purpose? How many of you that are watching this video have ever been part of a church choir? Maybe you just like to sing in church. And when we talk about church music in the 21st century in America, what do we talk about? Well, we call that praise and worship. And I've been on several praise and worship teams. I've been actual praise and worship leader. And the idea is simply, we want to bring the congregation closer to God. And I want to be careful not to offend anyone, and in this day and age of being politically correct. So if there are people that are watching this video right now that do not have faith, don't despair. That's okay. But you'll be over here in the secular side. For those of us that do have faith, we're over here in the sacred side. Because the purpose of the music is to bring people closer to God. Now, there's a great quote here in our textbook. Let me point it out to you. It's at the beginning, I believe, of the 14th chapter, which is page 89. Right under it says, chapter 14, Renaissance Sacred Music. All right, right underneath that title, John Calvin says this: we know by experience that song has great force and vigor to move and inflame the hearts of men, to evoke and praise God with a more vehement and ardent zeal. Nice quote. So what we're talking about is that early on, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, the men of the church understood that music could be a big part in bringing people not only involved in the church, but music could bring people closer to God. So that when we listen to the next piece of music that that I'm going to play for you, I don't want you to think of it as like, oh my God, that's a boring piece of music. I don't want you to give you opinion about the music. What I want you to remember is that this music was written specifically for the church. The idea being that it's part of the Mass, and it is designed to bring people closer to God. And this order that the church has is very specific. Now, when we move to chapter 12, right in the key points in the very beginning, you'll see the third key point. The most solemn ritual of the Catholic Church is a Mass. It's a daily service with two categories of prayer. The first is called the proper. So we'll write that down. Put it here. And the proper part of the Mass is the text that vary according to the day. So each day, each Mass has a different topic. And when the topic is changed, as part of the proper. The second part of the Mass is called the ordinary. And the ordinary is the part of the Mass that does not change. It's in every Mass. And the music that goes along with the ordinary is always the same. So some of the music, you'll have different songs, different music that goes with the proper, depending on what they're talking about. The ordinary is going to have similar music. This is right on page 75. 75. All right, so let me just go ahead and give you some of these pages right now. You go ahead and write them down. Page 75. You'll need to know everything that's on that page. The next page I want you to look at, page 82. You can go ahead and stop and you can write all these down. Then page 89. And finally, page 96. This is what this lecture is going to be concentrating on. Excuse me. Drop my pen lid. All right, so page 75, page 82, page 89, and page 96, and of course I already said page 70. So there's 5 pages of material right now that I want all of my students to know. You'll need to be responsible for knowing all of the material on those 5 pages. Now, after, and there, this is the prelude, and then chapters 12, 13, 14, 15. Keep in mind that it's not easy to talk about 1,000 years, 1,200 years of human history in 5 pages. Okay, so you know, as far as academic achievement, we're really splitting hairs here. But it is a music appreciation class. It's not designed to be a huge study of what's happening here. What is important to realize is that, notice that I have this word struggle written here in the middle. I wrote it there on purpose because you have the sacred world, the church world, and notice there's a lot more written over here underneath sacred than there is secular. The secular world is outside of the church. Your everyday Joe on the street. Folk music and chaos. Because they are outside of the church, they are outside of the noblemen, they're not living in a castle, they're barely alive. Music was there was music. Human beings have always sang. And we're talking about instruments that are very old and so forth. When we look at page 88, we talk about the most commonly used soft instruments were the recorder, which is an end-blown flute with a breathy tone. Essentially what we're talking about is just a little hollowed out stick is what a recorder was. Remember, we're not talking about you can't go down the street to your Guitar Center or to your music store on the corner or whatever. Music and musical instruments, especially in the secular world, handmade instruments. All right, so here's what I want to do now. I want to go back 1,500 years and start with some of the sacred music of that time. Listen to this line. Now, here's what you're going to hear. You're going to be hearing a monophonic single line melody. You're going to hear one man sing a melody that is part of the church service, praising God. Okay? And we can, I want to, what we're talking about here is pages 76 and 77. 78, 79. This idea of the original chant music. Okay. See what you think of this. So again, a monophonic, mono meaning one, single line melody. And the way that that piece goes on, we're talking about piece was written in the late 12th century. Pretty old music. But here's one thing I want you to remember. The melody that you just heard is using the same 12 notes as Jay-Z's using today, that Beethoven used, that Bach used, that all the music, sacred music of the church uses. Every piece of music that you are likely to hear in your lifetime is using the same notes that you just heard. And yet that music is 900 years old. Okay? So that's why it was important for me to give you 4 weeks of basic music understanding. Because the one thing that I can say is that, yes, we have sacred music on one hand, secular music on the other, but all of the music comes from 12 notes. And this is why at the beginning of this lecture, I spoke about how I'm not going to include African music, Indian music, Chinese music, Middle Eastern music, because those cultures in different parts of the world use more than 12 notes sometimes. All right. Now, what's important about this lecture is that as we move through time in the Renaissance, we go in church from a monophonic single line melody, then we start using multiple voices. When you listen to Music for a Night, which is in Week 1's folder, you hear how the melody is first sang by one person, and then multiple men will join in and sing exactly the same line as the single person does. It's not for a while yet that we move to multiple voices, and then we move to what we call polyphony. Polyphony is this idea of multiple voices, and we move into this idea of harmony, the idea of one man singing one note and another man singing a different note at the same time. And the rhythm is the same. In other words, just because we go from a single line to multiple lines, we're not changing up the rhythms yet. All right, so I want to play another piece. This is the Trio Triumvirum, the Gaude Maria, which again is also in your first week. Listening forward. All right, let me start from the beginning, excuse me. This is 3 male vocals, 3 men. Okay, now, 3 men making that. And notice how there's this wide range of sound. Well, where does that come from? If you haven't written this down, write it down quick. Stop my tape here, write this down. 70, 75, 82, 89, 96. Here's what's happening now. We spoke weeks ago about this idea of soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Soprano being the high female voice, alto, low female voice. Tenor, high male voice, bass and baritone, the low male voice. What you just heard was this idea of 3 distinct voices, a high part, middle part, and a low part. If you listen extremely closely, you'll hear that there are times where the low male part doesn't move rhythmically. It stays the same, and the other parts kind of float over the top. This is part of this new in development that we have. When we look at, let me go to page 12. Let's go back to our chapter 12, page 75 again. The key points where it says some chants are sung alternating a soloist and chorus in a responsorial performance. That was what that first one was. Now this was an early, it wasn't so much a call and response, it was just a single voice would sing and then the group voices would come in and double what the male voice was singing. Later on, we start to get this call and response, and I'm going to play you an example of that here in a moment. The next key point, the Paris Cathedral of Notre Dame was a center of organum, the earliest type of polyphony, with 2, 3, or 4 parts sung in fixed rhythmic patterns. Okay, and that's what's coming up. That's what I'm going to play for you next. What we need to understand is that all of this music was designed specifically to help in the church service. Music that was in the sacred world wasn't designed for enjoyment. It wasn't like, hey, let's go to this church because this guy's a really great singer. I really like what he does. Well, you may have liked the singing, but it wasn't designed for your pleasure. The singing was designed for the service. That's what this order is. Nothing that went on in the church didn't have some sort of purpose within the framework of the religious ceremony. The word patronage was the church's way of supporting and promoting music within the framework of the service. In other words, let's say that you like to sing, and you also like to write songs, and you would write you wrote a song that you think would be great to sing in church. And so you would go to your priest, you would go to your local Catholic church and say, hey, I have this song. They would look at you like you were crazy. They might invite you in and maybe want to have you sing, but you would have to do what they told you. Music wasn't designed where people from the outside would be brought in to add to the service. Now, we're going to talk about in a few minutes, you're going to hear me talk about what happened when this would become, you had a proliferation of secular music, secular musicians, people who were coming from a secular world and folk music world and wanting to put that into the church. Now, let's go back again to this word struggle. Let's modernize this lecture here a little bit. Up until this point, we're talking about music that's really, really old. Well, let's go to the 20th century. How many people in this room have heard of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, right? Everyone knows who Elvis is. Well, but were you aware that Elvis Presley, he's the king of rock and roll, he's over here in the secular world. When Elvis was playing at the International Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas, and he was singing all his rock songs and he's going crazy, the women are basically taking off their shirts, throwing their bras at him, going wild, wanting to get kissed by Elvis. But did you know that as soon as that show was over, Elvis would go back up into his suite, the top floor of this hotel, and for the next 3 or 4 hours would sing gospel music. It was as if Elvis wanted to get cleansed of the heathens and of the world that he just did. Elvis got paid because he was the king of rock and roll, but his world was in the church. If Elvis Presley would have only sang gospel music and been able to live the life that he lived, guess what? He would have done it. He had this struggle. Elvis Presley struggled with this idea of being the king of rock and roll and being from that world where all the sinners were going crazy, doing that devil music, and yet he wanted to be part of the gospel world. Elvis's favorite music was church music, was singing for the Lord. And he struggled with this his whole life. And it's no real accident that he died a young man, because it's a struggle that he never fully came to terms with. There are other artists that we're familiar with in the pop world. There's a gentleman by the name of Prince, and his real name is Prince Rogers Nelson. He's from Minneapolis. Prince has had a lot of hits. In fact, he struggled so much with being a rock star that he changed his name to a symbol, and then he became the artist formerly known as Prince. Well, I'm here to tell you that Prince is one of the most talented, multi-instrumentalist, great musicians of our time. He is one of the most recorded, if not the most recorded musician ever in history. And yet, we don't hear much of it because Prince is totally in charge of his life and his career. For every album that Prince has released, he's recorded 10 more than he hasn't. It'll be very interesting to see how the music world talks about Prince Rogers Nelson in 50 years, in 100 years. Because after he passes, it'll be, the thing that I will find most interesting, and I'm a lot older than Prince, so chances are I'm not going to ever hear any of this music, but I am fascinated by this idea of what kind of music is Prince going to release. Why? Because he's caught up in this struggle. Prince, a lot of times, has released some very risque music over the years. But he's also released some very much important sacred music. So he's dealing with a struggle. In the world today, you make your money in the secular world. But you get your soul cleansed and with sacred music. And people have been dealing with this, secular world, sacred world for 1,000 years. This is nothing new. And when you talk about Elvis Presley and Prince, we're talking about two of the most recorded, most rewarded, talented musicians of the last 50 years, and yet they struggle with this idea of secular music and sacred music. Okay, let's turn please in our textbooks to page 81, 80 and 81. Because now here's something that's I'm going to make the gentlemen in the class a little bit uncomfortable. On the textbook on page 80, you have on the left side of the page, you have a little thing that says, by the way, in the earliest years of the Christian church, women, although excluded from the priesthood, did sing in service as members of the congregation and the choir. When the church's practices standardized in the 4th century, however, church leaders embraced St. Paul's admonition that women keep silent in church, and congregational singing gave way to professional choirs of men and boys. Well, there we go. There's that word order again. And go back. When the church's practices standardized in the